Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Zara.
I'm Sam.
In the last week, two major US newspapers have announced they won't endorse a candidate for the US presidential election. It's a huge departure from the way legacy media has traditionally approached elections and has called into question the billionaire ownership of the two papers and what it could mean for editorial independence moving forward. In today's deep dive, we'll explain what's happened at the Washington Post and the LA Times and the fallout since.
So Zara, over the weekend, you and I were texting each other back and forth. Yeah, it was nice to chat. Over the news that the Washington Post and the LA Times, two of the biggest newspapers in America, announcing they won't endorse a candidate in next week's presidential election.
Next week's.
Isn't that crazy?
It's remarkable.
8 days to go. I want to start this conversation with the idea of endorsements.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean?
Yeah, so I do think that that's a good place to start because I actually wrote in our newsletter an introduction a few weeks ago saying, I think it was when the New York Times first came out with their endorsement, saying, what do you, the audience, think of endorsements? And the overwhelming feedback that I got from our newsletter audience was that people didn't know that it was a thing for newspapers to endorse candidates and that they'd actually never heard of this. And so I think this is one of those times where we need to kind of get outside of our media bubble zone and really just explain the lay of the land. So the reality is that it is extremely commonplace, and I'd say it's fairly widespread, that a media company or a news outlet will endorse a candidate or a party before an election. To give you a sense of how long this has been a thing, the New York Times first endorsed a candidate back in 1860. So that was when they endorsed Abraham Lincoln.
Wow.
So it's been quite a long time that this sort of idea of getting behind a candidate has been a thing, certainly in the US. Now, that endorsement can take many forms. It can look really different depending on who and what that outlet is, but it's almost always written and prepared by the opinion team of whatever outlet we're talking about. And I do think that it's important to note that at these big outlets, the opinion teams and the news teams are very separate.
And by opinion teams, you don't mean the people writing every day of their opinions. It's the people editing other people's opinions?
Yeah, so it's mostly like the editors who are running those opinion columns and they are coming together with some sort of unanimous position either way.
Right.
It's also not a uniquely American idea, I think I should add here. So in Australia, you'll see most of legacy media getting behind, it's usually not a candidate, it's usually a party just because of the way our system works. I was looking through what happened before the last federal election. The Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, The Guardian and the Canberra Times, they all got out and backed Labor, who obviously went on to win, and Anthony Albanese, who is now our Prime Minister, while News Corp's many papers and the Financial Review backed the coalition, which was, of course, led by Scott Morrison at the time. And I wanted to give you a sense of, before we go back into America, what it's like to read an editorial endorsement from an Australian news outlet. So I fished out some of those endorsements from the last federal election. I'll read you a bit of a line from The Age. It said, and I'm quoting here, "While we despair at the lack of truth-telling in this campaign, The Age believes a change of government is needed to begin restoring integrity to federal politics and to finally face up to the challenge of climate change."
So quite a strongly worded endorsement there.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's obviously only one side. That's in support of Labor. On the flip side, we had the Australian right. Mr. Morrison, speaking there of Scott Morrison, has endured the worst a world can throw at a national leader, and Australia has emerged stronger. Mr. Albanese has not proven himself ready to assume the high office he seeks.
Just before we keep going on this chat, when you said that they're writing their endorsements, who's it signed off by?
I mean, it varies on a paper-by-paper basis, but it is usually The Age or The Washington Post. It's that the entirety of that unit is behind whatever the call is.
Okay, so that's some helpful context to understand what endorsing a candidate or a party looks like here in Australia. The election, that's obviously only 8 days away, is in the US.
Yeah.
Give me a sense of what the endorsement landscape has looked like there.
Yeah, so I intimated this a bit before, but over the course of the last few months, we've seen all sorts of papers come out and endorse both Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. I'll quickly just run through one of each just to give you a sense of what's out there. The big one for Harris was the New York Times. They came out, if you thought what The Age wrote was strongly worded, take this one. They wrote, "The only patriotic choice for president." And the first line of that endorsement read, "It's hard to imagine a candidate more unworthy to serve as president of the United States than Donald Trump." So that was a little while back. And then Donald Trump has been endorsed by the New York Post, which is a Murdoch-owned paper, who in the last days said that Donald Trump is the clear choice for a better future. That editorial went on to say, "The burden is heavy on our shoulders this November, but Trump and Harris want to take us down very different roads, making the choice stark and simple but vital. Donald Trump is the right choice."
This is such an interesting discussion to have, especially considering the fact that both of those papers still need to report the news in the lead up to this election. And they've put their position out there and then they kind of go on doing the news.
Well, as I said before, there is this separation, or at least, I don't want to sound cynical. There is a separation, and these outlets have done this, as we said before, for hundreds of years. There is the opinion side or the commentary side of a news outlet, and then there is a news side. And as you'll see with what we get into here, there's never really been much issue of both sides reporting on the other.
Right.
And, it's not a new thing.
And that's what makes this situation so interesting is you have two major papers who have bucked the trend and they're not going to endorse a candidate. We're talking about the LA Times and the Washington Post. Let's start with the LA Times.
Yeah.
Where did that decision come from?
Well, that's the golden question, but I guess I'll just walk you through what happened, at least as we know it. So the news first broke that the LA Times wouldn't be endorsing either Harris or Trump sometime last week. And what's emerged since that time, and we're just going off what we understand based on what journalists who were involved in the process have said publicly. But what we understand from that is that the paper's editorial board was preparing to endorse Kamala Harris when the newspaper's owner intervened and blocked that decision. I do think that a bit of context is useful here. So the LA Times is the biggest metropolitan daily newspaper in the country, and I believe it's the third largest paper all across the country.
Wow.
It was bought by billionaire Patrick Soon-Shiong in 2018, and it's endorsed a candidate in every presidential election since 2009. Another piece of information I think is important here is that Kamala Harris is from California, and there is a lot to say about a Californian-based paper not backing the California candidate. So now back to what has happened as we understand it over the past few days. Shortly after news broke that the LA Times wouldn't be endorsing a candidate, there was kind of a string of resignations.
Wow.
One of those was the LA Times' editorials editor. That is a mouthful. Mariel Garza, who resigned quite publicly and then did a very long interview afterwards. She told the Columbia Journalism Review that "I am resigning because I want to make clear that I'm not okay with us being silent. In dangerous times, honest people need to stand up. This is how I'm standing up." As the fallout continued and more staff resigned and this story kind of took on a life of its own, owner Patrick Soon-Shiong then kind of had to wade in, and he tweeted his position, saying essentially that he had asked the board to provide what he called factual analysis on the positive and negative policies of both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, and he wanted those two things to be displayed side by side. He said that the board didn't do that, and thus they chose to remain silent.
I just want to go back to a point you just mentioned. Let's really think about this. We have an editorials editor who I can only imagine how many years they've had to put in to get to a position of seniority like that at a paper like the LA Times, resigning over a decision like this. That wasn't the only paper that had this issue.
No.
Let's talk about the Washington Post. And then I do want to talk about why this matters so much.
Yeah. The similarities between these two stories are almost eerie in nature. But over the weekend, or rather Friday local time in the US, the Washington Post announced it won't be endorsing a candidate. That's for the first time in 36 years. And it wasn't just that they weren't endorsing a candidate in this election cycle. The announcement also included the fact that they will never again endorse a presidential candidate. candidate.
So it's a permanent move.
Yeah. And so there was kind of this getting ahead of the story. So we had a full column published by the paper's publisher and CEO. His name is Will Lewis. He wrote that this is a statement in support of our readers' ability to make up their own minds on this, the most consequential of American decisions. He did concede in that column that, and I'll quote here, "This will be read in a range of ways, including a tacit endorsement of one candidate or a condemnation of another, or as an abdication of responsibility." Within hours of that announcement, similar to what happened at the LA Times, the Post's editor-at-large resigned, and there were a number of op-eds published even in the Washington Post itself, to that point we were talking about before, slamming the decision and saying that, it was just catastrophic. The editor-at-large, Robert Kagan, he then did the rounds in the media, and he suggested that the change in policy and the decision not to back a candidate was, as I said, like with the Times, thanks to the Washington Post's billionaire owner. Now, if you're not across this, the Washington Post was bought by Amazon founder, billionaire Jeff Bezos in 2013. I think a lot of our listeners would be very familiar with him and would be able to identify him, but perhaps not as many people know that he owns one of the biggest papers in, the Northern Hemisphere. So it's understood that the Washington Post was planning to endorse Kamala Harris and that Bezos intervened to make sure that didn't happen. Here is Kagan talking about that decision in an interview with CNN over the weekend.
Well, it was a pretty easy decision. This is obviously an effort by Jeff Bezos to curry favor with Donald Trump in the anticipation of his possible victory. Trump has threatened to go after Bezos's business. Bezos runs one of the largest companies in America. They have tremendously intricate relations with the federal government. They depend on the federal government. And Trump has made it clear that he will attack media organizations that are critical of him.
That's a pretty remarkable claim for somebody to make. And it is incredible to see an East Coast and a West Coast situation playing out almost at the same time. Both editorial boards wanting to endorse a candidate. Both
the same candidate,
wow,
it should be said.
Right, that's a good point. And both billionaire owners stepping in to stop that. Do you think we're seeing the death of the newspaper endorsement then?
I think that there's two parts to it. I think that the influence of mainstream kind of centralized news, opinion style information was already diminishing. And I think that there was already this movement away from wanting to do this sort of thing. But I think that's now tangled up in this idea of who should own the media and what do billionaires do with their power. So I think the natural kind of trend towards perhaps seeing fewer and fewer papers endorsing candidates is now really mixed into a bigger discussion about what it means and who should have the power in these sorts of decisions.
Take me inside the mind of somebody who's just resigned from their job. They might have been there. I mean,
Can't
it's not
say
you.
that.
You and I, we're still friends.
And goodbye.
Why do you think it matters so much to them that their paper endorses a candidate?
It all just comes down to editorial independence.
Right. So it's not the endorsement potentially itself as a function, but it's more like how much influence does this billionaire owner have over what's in the paper?
I mean, I don't think it's one or the other. I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
I think it's that a lot of Americans see this, as we said before, as a deeply consequential election. Either way, that whoever wins will forever change the nation and the world. And I think that for someone who has pursued their entire career in the media industry or in journalism to have a sort of intervention that comes in over the top and stops them from executing what they believe is their role or their kind of job in this space, I imagine that it would be an incredibly difficult thing to do, especially when the stakes are so high.
It's fascinating. Now, last question. You own a media company.
Yes.
Why has the Daily Aus not endorsed a candidate? We've been around for a couple of election cycles now. What was that decision about?
I mean, Sam, it's always been our belief that we should be telling people how to think, not what to think. And that's, for example, why we don't do opinion. It's why you won't read commentary in our newsletters or on our Instagram or here on our podcast. We provide analysis and we provide information, but we want audiences to be able to go and make up their own minds. And so when I think back to the last federal election and the impact that we had there, we partnered, for example, with the Australian Electoral Commission, and we tried to push people to enrol to vote. In my mind, that is a far more useful tool and a far more productive thing to do than telling people which way to vote, one way or the other, because I want people to have the facts and the knowledge and the foundation to be able to make those decisions and not just resort to a few people sitting in a newsroom in Sydney telling you what to think. Everyone has very different lived experiences. Everyone comes to those decisions on a personal level. And to be honest, I think that this should mark the end of these sorts of endorsements. I don't think that they're productive, but that's just my personal view. And, I know there are a lot of people who would disagree with me there.
And it's interesting that this conversation has been almost hijacked now by ownership, as you said, rather than the ethics you just talked us through.
It's two very big issues, and this is a whole nother podcast, but then we have Elon Musk, who also owns arguably one of the biggest channels of information dissemination in the world. And so we now have to understand what a landscape of billionaires owning information looks and feels like, and what we're okay to accept and what we're not okay to accept.
Understanding how the media works, who owns it and why it's there has never been more important for Americans, but I dare say probably for all of us across the world. Zara, thank you for that. And thank you for joining us on the Daily Aus this morning. If you do want to support independent media, that's a nice segue there, you can sign up to our newsletter. I'll throw a link in the comments. That's algorithm-free news to your inbox every day. We'll be back again with another episode of the Daily Aus tomorrow. Until then, have a good one.